Hello and welcome to What's in a Remake, the show where I review and compare remakes and remasters of games to their original versions. In the first two episodes of this series I covered Final Fantasy VII and its remake, but now I'm going to cover something completely different, both in terms of art style, gameplay, and tone. Today I will be covering Spongebob Squarepants Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, the 2020 remake of the beloved cult classic from the early 2000s. This is a game that I personally don't have any real attachment to myself, but I know a lot of people that do, and even if I didn't play it back then, I did watch a lot of the Spongebob cartoon, and even played the movie video game, which was somewhat of a pseudo-sequel to this one, when I was younger. So I have somewhat of a soft spot for the source material, which resulted in me eventually picking up a copy of the Rehydrated version to see if all the hype surrounding it was warranted. And just because I really wanted a new 3D platformer to play during the whole lockdown situation going on currently, because let's face it, there aren't that many 3D platformer games coming out this year, with the only real exception I can think of possibly being Crash Bandicoot 4. As always, the opinions I convey over the course of this video are my own, and if you disagree with them then that's completely fine. The world would be boring if everyone shared the same opinion after all, so feel free to share your opinion in the comments below. I'm curious to know what you all think of this game, especially if you grew up with the original. Now anyway, I've prattled on long enough. Without further ado, this is What's in a Remake Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated. Spongebob Squarepants Battle for Bikini Bottom was originally released on Xbox, PlayStation 2, GameCube, Windows PC and Game Boy Advance in October 2003 in the US and a month later in Europe. Though I should clarify that the Windows PC and Game Boy Advance versions are completely different games from the other releases by completely different developers. The version we'll be covering in this video will be the console version, which was what Rehydrated was based off. The original Battle for Bikini Bottom was developed by Heavy Iron Studios and published by THQ, and was mostly received with modest critical reception and an incredibly positive cult following since its release, setting it apart from most other license-based tie-in games released during that PS2, Xbox and GameCube generation, which usually amounted to little more than critically panned forgettable shovelware. In 2020, a full remaster of the console version of the game was released titled Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, developed by Purple Lamp Studios and published by THQ Nordic, which completely remade the graphical assets in a new, more modern art style, remastered the soundtrack, added extra language dubs and subs, as well as adding a completely arbitrary multiplayer horde mode to the game that reutilizes some of the cut content from the original game in a new way. The remake was received for the most part the same exact way from critics and fans as the original did, with reviewers praising the graphical updates but deriding the gameplay for being the same as in the original and without fixing any of the flaws from the original game. But what did I think, as someone who's never played the original game? Well, the story in Rehydrated is pretty much exactly the same as in the original game, in which Plankton, the main antagonist of the SpongeBob series, sets loose an army of robots on Bikini Bottom, so it's up to SpongeBob and his friends Patrick and Sandy to destroy the robots and collect golden spatulas, the core collectible of the game, which are used to open up new levels, as well as to access the final boss and save the day. The story for the most part is fairly bare bones and is only really used as an instrument to push the game forward, so don't go in expecting a groundbreaking narrative with shocking twists and turns, because that's not really what the game's about. It should be said though that for what it is, I thought that the story was quite entertaining, and did exactly what it needed to in a satisfying way. Each level also has its own little mini story going on. For example, the Jellyfish Field storyline involves SpongeBob tracking down jellyfish jelly from the king jellyfish in order to heal Squidward's injuries that he's inflicted at the beginning of the stage. They're mostly just small, inconsequential little storylines to tie the theming of the level together a bit better, and are almost completely separated from the core storyline. The core difference between Battle for Bikini Bottom and Rehydrated is the visual style, which has drastically been changed and updated in Rehydrated to make full use of current gen graphical techniques and enhancements, with every model, texture and visual effect remade completely from the ground up. What is in my opinion the most notable difference in the art style of Rehydrated over the original is just how bright and colourful everything is, compared to the fairly muted colour scheme of the original game. This change is, in my opinion, mostly for the better, as it makes a lot of the environments such as the Jellyfish Fields and the Goo Lagoon a lot more aesthetically pleasing. For example, the brighter lighting and colour tones in the Jellyfish Fields level make the grassy plains and all the items and enemies on them pop a lot more clearly than they did in the original, which is an essential change since the grass effects in that level in particular are a lot more dense than they were in the original. The enhanced lighting in Rehydrated overall, in my opinion, improves pretty much every aspect of the original's art style, making each level feel more unique and iconic, as the muted colours of the original tended to make a lot of the areas feel somewhat samey in my opinion. I particularly like the bloom lighting used on the neon lights for At the Rock Bottom stage, as well as on the lighting in the Flying Dutchman stage, as it does a great job of adding an ominous and eerie atmosphere to the mostly dark and dreary levels. The character models in the game have also been updated, both in terms of the overall graphical fidelity, as well as in terms of their general design, opting more to try and replicate the modern design of the characters as featured in the more recent seasons of the cartoon, rather than the original game's version. This change does suit the remake in my opinion, and the character models mesh with the updated brighter art style very well, and all in all look really quite great. The characters in Rehydrated also have both more animations, as well as updated existing animations, which help to both make the characters appear more expressive and livelier, but also to slip in a couple references and nods to the show, demonstrable through some of the characters' new idle animations. The locations in Rehydrated are greatly enhanced by the drastic leap in technology since the original's release. Areas such as the Jellyfish Fields and Kelp Forest are now dense with foliage, which is a huge step up in detail from the original and helps to make the environments look a lot more diverse and distinguished. The shadows in the game though are surprisingly the weakest of the graphical enhancements in Rehydrated that I've noticed, as for the most part they are barely improved and in some places even worse than the original game's shadows, with most of the NPCs in the game just having generic circles underneath them for shadows, though at least the buildings and the environments themselves mostly have pretty good baked shadows, and the player characters, such as SpongeBob, have really nicely animated shadows, though to be fair they are exactly the same as the ones they had in the original game. Suffice to say, the graphical advancements made in Rehydrated breathe new life into the game, and for the most part it is far superior to the original in terms of graphical fidelity, but that's not to say that the graphical enhancements are completely perfect, as aside from the mediocre shadows mentioned earlier, I also found a couple graphical issues here and there that were somewhat annoying to see. For example, when I was exploring the Spongebob Stream level, I noticed that the giant model of Squidward that they used in the level was noticeably very low poly, as you can see from how large and noticeable the squares that make up the model are, which could be a result of them simply reusing the regular Squidward model and scaling it up, without increasing the level of detail to compensate for the larger size, which would normally be fairly fine for the other large models used throughout the level, since you can't reach those and they are far away, so the lack of detail in those models isn't very noticeable. But since you can get right up to the Squidward model, it can be a quite jarring quality disparity from everything else. There are also graphical glitches here and there, with one such case being of this signpost in the hub world, where the shadow quality noticeably pops in a higher quality shadow as you get close to it, instead of a seamless transition between shadow detail levels. None of these issues break the game, and from what I've seen throughout playing the game twice on both PS4 Pro and PC, most of the game is very polished and is consistent in graphical quality, making the issues I mentioned outliers on that front, though admittedly I wasn't paying too close attention as I was playing the game, so there may be more graphical issues than just the ones I encountered. In terms of performance, I played Rehydrated on PC with modern hardware and on an SSD, and saw a constant 60 frames per second frame rate, with minimal dips and maximum graphical settings at a 1440p resolution, though 4K is an option, but I just couldn't get it to work for whatever reason. At the very least, it looks like the game is well optimized for modern PC hardware, though I think judging by the performance on other consoles it probably won't take much to run at a stable frame rate. I also played the game on PS4 Pro with similar results to when I played on PC, though from what I've seen from videos online it looks like the base PS4, base Xbox One and Nintendo Switch versions suffer from quite variable frame rates that, while still over 30, are very shaky and below 60, especially on the Nintendo Switch, which also suffered from several visual downgrades such as less anti-aliasing due to the significantly less powerful hardware. It's still a solid version of the game though if you want to play it on the go, though if you mostly play games at home, any of the other versions of the game would definitely be preferential, as a shaky frame rate above 30 FPS is a lot worse than a solid consistent 30 frames per second, at least in my opinion. In terms of graphical differences between versions, I couldn't particularly notice anything different aside from resolution, with PlayStation 4 Pro and base PS4 running at a native 1080, Xbox One X running at a dynamic 4K resolution with dips as low as 1800p, and the Switch version docked runs the game at an atrocious 600p and a tolerable 480p in handheld mode. I've also noticed from the footage I've seen online that all console versions, and I assume PC versions using HDD storage instead of SSD storage, suffer from quite a lot of texture and object popping, especially during cutscenes, which is a problem commonly found with current gen games running on the Unreal Engine 4. In conclusion, when it comes to the visuals and performance, both the original and the Rehydrated versions are great for what they are, and even though I personally prefer the Rehydrated's art style, I can understand why some people would still prefer the originals despite the significant graphical enhancements the newer version has. I also have to say that despite most of the enhancements in Rehydrated being incredibly good, in particular the more diverse and detailed environments, excellent character models, animations and lighting, as well as the general performance on most systems, I'm a little disappointed by how skin deep some of the graphical enhancements feel. For example, the plethora of poor shadows on NPCs and on some objects, the very disappointing Switch performance, and the overall lack of any PS4 Pro enhancements over the base PS4 version. It does make me wonder though that if they had a couple more weeks or months of development time, whether they could have sorted out those negatives and really made the Rehydrated version shine. But they were probably under a time constraint due to the upcoming Spongebob movie, or the whole COVID-19 pandemic could have seriously affected the development. I don't know. It feels like from what I've heard online that they wanted to do more but couldn't in the time allotted to them. And to be fair, what they did manage to do is still commendable and looks great considering all that. The soundtrack for Battle for Bikini Bottom is surprisingly really quite good, despite the small number of tracks in the game, with each level and boss receiving its own unique track, all of which are very well suited for the location and the time that they play. From what I can tell, the soundtracks for both the original and the rehydrated version are exactly the same, only the rehydrated version's audio was remastered to have a stereo output instead of the original's mono output, so a lot of the instrumentation is a lot clearer as a result. In my opinion, because of that, the rehydrated version easily has a better soundtrack, as it's a lot clearer, and because of that, a lot of the details in the tracks that were too quiet or muted in the original mono versions can finally be heard in the newer game. In terms of which track specifically I like the most in the game, I'd probably say the track that plays in Rock Bottom, as well as the track for the Kelp Forest level are my personal favourites. Rock Bottom's music I like mainly because it sounds like something you'd hear in a Metal Gear game, and because the level in particular has a large focus on stealth and emits a dark and gloomy atmosphere, which fits the music track in the level quite well. Kelp Forest's track I like purely because the instruments used really make the forest feel alive, with all the noises sounding like birds and bugs adding to that notion. The drumming throughout the track also gives it a feeling of mysticism and almost a tribal quality to it, as you're exploring the wilderness and encountering enemies, bouncing on springs and interacting with tiki heads to solve puzzles. Overall, the soundtrack to the game is for the most part quite stellar, with each track fitting the theming of the levels they are presented in, though admittedly some of the tracks, such as the one that plays in the hub world, can get quite stale after a while. I also think that while it's a great soundtrack that does a good job of accompanying the game's levels, it's not a particularly memorable one for me personally, though obviously that's due to my personal preferences, and other people might find it a lot more memorable than I did. In terms of voice acting, the game's English dub is exactly the same in both versions, and for the most part it's good, with most of the cast members from the show reprising their roles, though both Mr. Krabs and Mermaid Man were recast and sound completely different to their show counterparts, and it's quite off-putting, especially since they're the only characters where their original voice actor didn't reprise their roles. So when other characters interact with them, it just doesn't sound right.
This is making the Krusty Krab lose money like a sinking ship. No money means no more Krusty Krab. No more Krusty Krab means no more fry cooking for you.
No more fry cooking?
But because you're gullible,
In terms of localization, dubbing and subbing, sadly English appears to be the only language available in the original console release. However, Rehydrated goes above and beyond and recorded full French, Italian, German, Spanish, Polish and Japanese dubs for the game, with subtitles available in all the dub languages, as well as Indonesian, Russian, South Korean, Chinese, Brazilian, Indian and Malaysian. I personally played the game with the Japanese dub because the Japanese voice for Plankton is absolutely brilliant, and everyone else sounded very similar to their English dub counterparts.
とうとうこの日がやってきたな。ついにカーニバーガーの秘密のレシピを盗み出すための素晴らしい計画を思いついたぞ。そのせいでビキニタウンが破壊されても仕方のないことだね。俺様が発明したロボットコピー機3000でロボットクローンをたくさん作り出し、そして破壊と混乱をもたらしてやるぞ。
In short, I think it's quite commendable that THQ Nordic and Purple Lamp Studios went out of their way to add so many language options to the game, and I hope it encourages the game to reach a much larger audience as a result. The gameplay in Battle for Bikini Bottom is fairly typical for most 3D platformers, with the player being able to run, jump and attack their way across several levels, learning new abilities as they go, which they can use to reach previously unreachable areas or defeat enemies that are weak to their new abilities. You can play as 3 different characters, each with their own unique abilities and gameplay styles, though they all have basic moves and attacks that they all can do, such as just attack and double jump. The first of the playable characters is of course Spongebob Squarepants himself, who has a vertical attack that can defeat floating enemies or activate buttons, as well as a wind-up bowling ball attack that can be used to solve puzzles and injure enemies. Though from my experience the hit detection on the bubble bowling ball is a bit iffy and sometimes doesn't do damage despite hitting an enemy, and any puzzle that uses it is more often than not a really clunky, unenjoyable time. He also has a sneak move which is pretty much useless from what I've seen, as most of the situations where the game tells you to use it, it's almost more convenient to use a completely different move. Like for instance this one area in Rock Bottom where you need to sneak along the platforms that crumble to progress, but simply jumping on them and quickly jumping to the next before it completely collapses is a lot more efficient and feels better to control. Spongebob also has a homing missile he unlocks near the end of the game, but you rarely need to use it except for 3 to 4 sections of the game and for the final boss fight, and it's borderline worthless for combat, as there is a delay to using it that leaves you very vulnerable to attacks. From what I've experienced in the game, Spongebob definitely has the most variety when it comes to unique moves, but in turn a lot of them are used sparingly and you won't find much use of them in most of the game. The second playable character is Patrick, who has the special ability of being able to pick up objects and throw them, either to activate switches, solve puzzles, or damage enemies. Overall, he's alright, but probably the worst character to play as he feels slow and a lot of the sections where you play as him just really aren't that fun to progress through, due to the focus on puzzle solving. The final playable character is Sandy, who is easily the most versatile for platforming of the playable characters, and thus the most fun to play as. She can glide, as well as swing from special lasso markers, making traversing the levels as her quite enjoyable and fluid. She can also use her lasso to instantly kill any enemy in the game regardless of their weaknesses, making her the most powerful in terms of usability, though at the same time she cannot activate floor switches because unlike Patrick and Spongebob, she can't do a ground pound attack. For the most part, you'll be spending most of the game playing as Spongebob, as the other 2 characters are only playable in certain levels, and as such the levels are designed with those characters in mind. So for example, with the levels where Sandy is playable, such as SpongeBob's Dream or Rock Bottom, they gear more towards fun platforming, whilst the Patrick levels such as the Murmur and Kelp Forest gear more towards puzzle platforming, with large portions of the levels dedicated to solving puzzles, which to be honest can be a bit arduous. Personally, I loved all of the Sandy SpongeBob levels, and whilst I enjoyed some of the SpongeBob Patrick levels, in particular Jellyfish Fields and Goo Lagoon, the others were kind of boring and were probably the worst levels in the game as a result. Whilst we're on the topic of levels, it's probably best to explain how most of them are structured. Most levels are fairly linear yet open areas with various different objectives to be completed, some given by NPCs, some involving collecting all of a level specific collectible, or beating a boss at the end of it. For the most part, you can 100% complete most of the levels the first time you run through them, the only exception really being the Jellyfish Fields and the Bikini Bottom downtown, which are the only ones to require you to replay it once you've unlocked all of SpongeBob's abilities. Why only those 2 require replaying, I have no idea, and I'd rather have been able to complete it fully from the get-go, considering they're the first 2 levels in the game, but oh well. In terms of the gameplay itself, the most enjoyable levels are definitely the ones that focus more on platforming, as aside from some depth issues here and there, it's where the gameplay shines, especially when playing as Sandy, where swinging on lasso points and gliding are surprisingly very satisfying. The puzzles on the other hand tend to drag the game to a halt, and though it's commendable that they attempt to make use of the character's abilities to solve them, it's just a bit too finicky, and failure penalises you by just forcing you to try again, and as a result, it just feels tedious and tiring to solve the puzzles in the game. Thankfully though, there really aren't that many puzzles in the game, but the worst ones, such as the Tiki puzzle in the Kelp Forest and the Ball puzzle in the Murmur in particular, take ages to complete if you're not good at the mechanics, and definitely make an impression on you. A bad one, but oh well, at least they're memorable, I suppose. The cut content from the original battle for Bikini Bottom, which consisted of a Robo-Squidward boss battle, a different version of Patrick's dream instead of the one shown in game, and an extra phase to the Robo-Spongebob final boss fight, were originally touted as being restored for the Rehydrated version. However, this is both true and not true. Whilst the content is restored in the sense that it can be seen in game, as in the assets can be seen, they're instead used in a new multiplayer horde mode style game that can be accessed from the main menu. In this mode you can play as 7 different characters: SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Gary, Squidward and Roboplankton, though they all feel the same to play as, even the characters that you could play as in the main game. And you have to face off against waves of enemies as Robo-Squidward watches in the background, with one of the stages being made up of the same terrain intended to be used in the cut Patrick's dream level. Honestly, this mode is just a tedious, boring slog that is not fun to play due to the basic combat, repetitive enemies, and it's just a complete waste of time due to the lack of any rewards whatsoever. And it's just a waste, it's awful. Don't play it, even if you just don't play it. The biggest criticism I can give to the Rehydrated version of the game is that the only real difference between it and the original that I've noticed is the graphical advancements, different art style and pathetically dreadful horde mode, which I guess is fine, except it doesn't solve any of the problems that the original game had in terms of its gameplay. For example, they could have attempted to fix some of the dodgy hitboxes and collision detection with the gameplay and the character mechanics. They also could have made some of the puzzles in the game a lot more enjoyable, or actually integrated the cut content into the main game in a meaningful way. What is here is still mostly good, but at the end of the day it's just the original game with a nicer coat of paint, which again I suppose is fine, but remakes and remasters are a perfect opportunity to fix the problems of the past, and they completely miss that chance, which is kind of really disappointed, even as someone who didn't grow up with the original, but knows of it in passing. In regards to completion rewards, there are 3 different types of collectibles to collect in the game. The core collectible is of course the golden spatulas, which you'll need increasing amounts of to access later levels, as well as to access the boss fights in the game. In total, you need about 75 to finish the game, which should only take a few hours to do. I will admit that the purpose of the spatulas does kinda confuse me. Why are the characters collecting them? Why is progression gated by collecting them? I get that they were trying to mimic stars from Mario, but in those games the stars are presented a lot better, and Mario actually is shown using them to unlock new areas, and it makes a lot more sense why you need them to unlock those areas. Where in this game, you're just told to collect spatulas until you've got enough to access the next area, and that's that. The characters establish that they're collecting them, but not for what purpose, and you never see them actually use them in game, so it just feels like you're just doing it to fill a checklist. I get that SpongeBob is a fry cook, so that's at least a reason as to why the prime collectible in the game looks like them, but I know I'm probably overreacting to it, but sometimes missing details like this, or not putting enough effort into those details, makes the game feel a little bit cheap and less cohesive compared to its alternatives. The second type of collectible is Patrick's socks, which are hidden throughout the levels and hub world, and on collecting 10 can be returned to Patrick in the hub for a golden spatula. These are themed a lot better than the spatulas because at least you actually have to hand them in once you've collected them for your reward, and it makes sense that Patrick would want to collect his lost clothing, and also it's themed towards a character. Finally, the third collectible type is the shiny objects, which are used as a core currency in the game and can be used to purchase golden spatulas from Mr. Krabs in the hub, purchase access to extra parts of levels to get more spatulas, and also to purchase access to the Reef, a cinema in the hub which allows you to see concept art from the game. This again has better theming and purpose than the spatulas, but I don't get why they didn't just use regular money like coins and bills as the currency collectible, as it's quite heavily emphasised in the show just how much Mr. Krabs likes money, and it would have tied it all together a bit better than just generic colourful shapes. For the most part, the collectibles are handled well though, despite my minor gripes and over-exaggerated criticisms. However, the rewards for collecting everything is overall a little lacking, since collecting all of the golden spatulas and socks only rewards you with a post-credits cutscene where the cast of the game sings the theme song of the show, which is a neat little theme but nowhere near worth the time investment for full completion. The grind for collecting enough shiny objects to access the cinema, as well as the last few golden spatulas from Mr. Krabs, is also not worth the time investment, especially in the Rehydrated version, where they inexplicably made the cost of purchasing the golden spatulas significantly higher without increasing the rate of shiny objects you can get at a time in the game, which means it will take more and more hours of grinding just to collect them, let alone unlock the cinema, which will take hours on top of that, making the entire ordeal of 100% completion feel much less worth it than in the original. In terms of trophy or achievement completion for the Rehydrated version on modern consoles, none of the achievements really require you to unlock the cinema anyway, and aside from the 100% completion based trophies, most of them will pop as you progress with the game, so if you really want to collect all the trophies, it's not all too bad, though you will have to grind for a few hours for those last golden spatulas from Mr. Krabs. So yeah, in conclusion, 100% completing the game does not feel anywhere near worth it for a casual player of the game. Well, in the Rehydrated version of the game anyway, where the shiny object spatulas costs are severely inflated and tedious to achieve. Though if you're a die-hard completionist or playing the original game, or just an avid trophy or achievement collector, it'll probably still be worth your time, as it's not particularly hard or long to complete. Just the latter portion of the completion run will be a tedious grind. All in all, Battle for Bikini Bottom is still an enjoyable game that mostly still holds up today. The Rehydrated version of the game is a decent remake with excellent visual advancements and extra language options to bring it up to current gen graphical standards. Yet, at the same time, it makes no attempt to fix any of the problems of the original, and even makes them worse, as shown with Mr. Krabs' golden spatulas costing significantly more than in the original. Considering though that you can easily get both the original game and Rehydrated for fairly cheap, there's really no reason for anyone not to at least try it if you're a fan of the show, or just 3D platformers in general. Though I would advise waiting for the Rehydrated version to go on sale before purchasing, because even though it's a budget title and released for cheap anyway, I'm still not certain it's worth the full price of admission, unless you're a hardcore fan of either the series or the original game. What did I personally think about the game though, as someone who didn't play it growing up? Honestly, it's pretty good. The levels are all unique and interesting. Collecting spatulas is fun for the most part, yet lacking something compared to other collectathon platformers such as the stars in Mario or the other collectibles in Spyro. The characters for the most part are all quite fun to play as, and the game makes ample use of most of their abilities throughout, and I just had a real blast playing through it and picking up on all the references to the show. So yeah. All in all, I do still highly recommend either version of the game to fans of both Spongebob and 3D platformers, as the gameplay is for the most part solid, if dated and lacking in some areas. The levels are mostly fun, though there are one or two that aren't great due to some long and unenjoyable puzzle sections. Which version of the game in particular do I prefer? Probably definitely have to be the Rehydrated version. as even though I may have sounded kinda pessimistic of it during this review, due to it essentially being the same as the original, just with extra graphical enhancements, those enhancements made, as well as the smaller details improved on, are significantly enough in my opinion to make it a superior version of the game, and I just like the art style a lot more. Though I can still see some people preferring the original's more muted art style, especially if they played that version back in the day, as it does have its unique charms and quirks to it, and the original as well is still more enjoyable to complete overall due to the significantly lower cost to collect those final spatulas from Mr. Krabs. My only hope is that in the future Purple Lamp Studios are given the opportunity to either remaster one of the other well-remembered yet flawed SpongeBob games, such as the SpongeBob movie game, or maybe even make their own brand new SpongeBob game. Only time will tell, but judging by how well they remastered Battle for Bikini Bottom, I think whatever project they work on next will be in good hands, provided of course that they're given enough time to work on it to a significant degree. But anyway, that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, where we took a quick look at Battle for Bikini Bottom and a much closer look at the Rehydrated remaster. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, as it helps the channel out, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game. I know it's a really beloved game for some people, so it'd be interesting to know what you thought of the Rehydrated version in particular. Until then though guys, this has been Kingdom H, signing off.